Why No One Could Find Mengele, Alan Dulles and the German SS, by Peter Dale Scott, published in the Threepenny Review, number 23, autumn 1985. By July 1945, Joseph Mengele had been captured and identified at an Allied prisoner of war camp. An eyewitness has just told a congressional committee that not only the prisoner's name was known, but also the general nature of his crimes as doctor, experimenter, and executioner at Auschwitz. Yet, like so many of his fellow members of the SS, Mengele was somehow allowed to disappear, to re-emerge 10 years later in Latin America. 20 years ago, few would have believed that the victorious Allies in the so-called Good War could have deliberately allowed a sadistic mass murderer like Mengele to go free. From the revelations since the Eichmann trial, however, it has become only too obvious that OSS, the wartime precursor of today's CIA, arranged for numbers of wanted criminals to escape from camps, and when necessary supplied them with new identities to protect them from justice. Murderers, far from being exempted from such protection, seem to have been among those most likely to obtain it. This is particularly true of those SS veterans whose careers have been most closely linked to Mengele's in Latin America. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Leon, in Bolivia; Walter Rauff, supervisor of the SS mobile gas chambers in Chile; and Friedrich Schwend, yet another wanted murderer, in Peru. Like Mengele, all three of these men developed links with neo-fascist elements in the military and/or interior ministries of their new countries. All collaborated in repressive operations against the left, particularly at the time of the CIA-assisted overthrow of the Allende regime in Chile. Barbie and Schwend at least have acted in this capacity through arms deals with the German firm Merex AG, a proprietary firm of the German BND intelligence service, itself a descendant of the Gehlen intelligence network, which in 1945 passed from the leadership of the Nazi SS to that of American intelligence, and eventually the CIA. After World War II, while the CIA and the Gehlen org were being slowly organized on the United States payroll, both Barbie and Schwend worked for United States Army Counterintelligence, CIC, and at this time, Schwend was working on setting up the secret SS escape routes to Latin America, by which both men would eventually re-establish themselves. It has been charged that Rauff played an even more prominent role in setting up this escape route, while also on the American payroll, and that he did so with an immunity granted to him by Alan Dulles of OSS after the SS-OSS secret, and sometimes unauthorized, negotiations in North Italy, in which, unquestionably, both Dulles and Rauff participated. The primary purpose of these secret talks was to secure a separate Nazi and fascist surrender in North Italy, and at least partly to prevent a de facto seizure of power by Italian communist partisans behind the Nazi lines. But even the intense fixation which OSS and SS shared about reducing the inevitable communist role in post-war Europe does not appear to diplomatic historians to explain the zealous intensity with which Dulles, at times in direct contravention of written orders, pursued negotiations for a surrender which preceded that of VE Day by just 6 days. With the same excessive zeal, future CIA personnel protected the convicted war criminal Barbie and concealed him from the French authorities, who knew very well that American intelligence was hiding him from them. A recent Justice Department report on the United States handling of the Barbie case is clearly an essay in damage limitation, while suppressing the rather obvious connections to the Gehlen org and its then employers, the CIA. The role of Schwend, and almost certainly Rauff, in exfiltrating whole cadres of wanted SS criminals while on the American payroll only confirms recent speculations that the SS networks were being preserved for post-war anti-communist activities as the result of an arrangement negotiated with Dulles and his OSS superiors. Could Mengele, not a political policeman like Rauff and Barbie, but a doctor with a penchant for lethal experiments on human guinea pigs. Could even Mengele have been saved as the result of a secret deal between Dulles and the SS? Such a hypothesis would once have been almost unthinkable. But we have since learned that his colleague in the Auschwitz human experiments, Walter Schreiber, was shielded by the Americans from a Polish conviction in absentia so that he could help guide the post-war researches of the United States Air Force in bacteriological warfare. In 1952, Schreiber was helped by American officials to re-establish himself via Argentina in Paraguay. 1952 is the year that Mengele himself appeared in Argentina, moving to Paraguay 2 years later. Despite the books, articles, and TV programs about Mengele, the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, less is known for certain about his post-war activities than those of any comparable war criminal. Apart from his extended residence in Paraguay, where he gained citizenship in 1957 and was stripped of it in 1979, little has been documented. But in one of the best books to appear about the post-war network of Rauf, Schwend, and Mengele, the so-called Kameradenwerk, the career of Mengele is closely implicated. The book is The Bormann Brotherhood by William Stevenson, himself a wartime intelligence operative with access to intelligence sources, including the records of Donovan and their mutual friend, Sir William Stevenson of the British SOE. According to Stevenson, Mengele had worked in a restricted military zone of Paraguay with the wartime Croatian dictator Ante Pavelić, whose Croatian Catholic connections undoubtedly played central roles in the escapes of Rauf, Schwend, and Barbie. Pavelić had initially made contact with the Latin American Nazi Kameradenwerk through Rauf. With respect to Mengele's finances, Stevenson mentions the Kameradenwerk representative in Ecuador,
Alphonse Zassin, the representative of the Brotherhood,
Kameradenwerk,
business enterprise known as Estrella. It is said, too, that Zassin is financed by Dr. Josef Mengele, who controls now such funds as remain liquid from the sale of European loot.
This is important, since post-war SS funds had earlier been administered by Friedrich Schwend, who had used them, apparently with United States connivance and support, for the exfiltration of himself and other top SS members. Schwend apparently ceased to play this role after he and a band of Croatians under his control were exposed in a 1972 Peruvian murder scandal in which Mengele was a suspect. Zassin, a Dutch SS officer and convicted war criminal, is chiefly remembered for his extended record of Eichmann's revelations to him in 1957, which formed a major exhibit in the Eichmann trial. Stevenson elsewhere names this Estrella company as the subsidiary of a financial consortium controlled from Bolivia by Schwend's business partner Klaus Barbie. In the early 1960s, Barbie
set up a company called Estrella, ostensibly dealing in quinquina bark. Although no records exist in the public registry in La Paz, at least one Bolivian arms dealer still remembers it as a weapons trading company.
It appears that Barbie and Estrella did export quinquina bark as agents for the German drug firm Boehringer, which grew rich on quinine contracts to the United States Army during the Vietnam War. But the primary business of Barbie and Schwend was arms trafficking, carried on through two German-based firms, Merex and Gemetex. The two Nazis acted as agents, negotiating purchases not only on behalf of the Bolivian and Peruvian governments, but, through their friendship with the Nazi Hans Rudel, sales to Paraguay and Chile, and through Otto Skorzeny in Spain, further deals in Madrid. Merex AG, itself set up in 1963, was an arms company owned and controlled by the Gaylen BND, while Skorzeny was one of the top go-betweens in the post-war deals between Gaylen, the SS, and the CIA. Barbie's arms deals, concerted in this way with Western intelligence, were politically influential as well as economically lucrative. They involved him, according to French sources, in the drug trafficking business of Auguste Ricoeur, a Corsican Nazi collaborator who, like Mengele, was established with high-level connections in Paraguay. And it was apparently the Nixon administration's determination to break the Ricoeur ring, which first made the CIA begin reporting on Mengele's own involvement in the drug traffic. A brief glance at the post-war career of Klaus Barbie shows how relatively small a role in his prosperity was played by post-war Nazi cabals, such as the well-publicized Odessa Die Spinne. Condemned to death by the French for genocidal murders in Lyon, Barbie was concealed and protected for 4 years in Germany by the United States Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, who were using him as an informant to spy on, ironically, the French. After the communists were dropped from General de Gaulle's cabinet, the Nazi Barbie was reassigned to spy on the America houses set up by the State Department, which were, according to Barbie's American handler, stocked with all kinds of left-wing literature. Barbie's reports may thus have helped fuel the attack on this program 5 years later by Joe McCarthy, whose charges against the State Department were based on documents leaked to him by a source in Army intelligence. Finally, one can hardly ignore the fact that the protection and exfiltration of Barbie were handled at the top and at the bottom of the American hierarchy by men with OSS, OPC, CIA connections. George Nigoy, the Austrian CIC agent who secured Barbie's false documentation and would personally deliver him through Austria to Father Draganovich in Genoa, was himself about to enter the CIA. At Haikog, the preparation of misleading reassurances to the French was being handled by John Bross, a veteran of OSS paramilitary operations, who in April 1951 would join the Eastern European Division of OPC, working closely with the Galen Org. A resolution of what other agency picked up Barbie in 1951 would be of great help in understanding the post-war career of Joseph Mengele. For there is no doubt at all that in Latin America, Barbie became part of an international intelligence network working directly with proprietaries of Galen's BND, and little doubt that Mengele was intimately connected to this network also. The unlikely possibility that Barbie, with his store of embarrassing secrets, was left to start a new future on his own, has been refuted by Barbie himself. Though Alan A. Ryan, in a 1983 Justice Department investigation, asserts that Barbie was the only Nazi to be exfiltrated by CIC down the Ratline, Barbie recalls that the other occupants in his Genoa hotel were all Nazi fugitives, among them Eichmann himself. According to Barbie, Draganovich told him his reasons were purely humanitarian. He helped both Catholics and Protestants, but mostly they were SS officers, about 200 in all, anti-communists. He said to me, "We've got to keep a sort of reserve on which we can draw in the future." I think that was the Vatican's motive as well. Indeed, the Vatican did have a program underway for the exfiltration of anti-communists. This was the work of Bishop Alois Hudal of the Collegium Teutonicum, a priest close both to Pius XII and the future Paul VI, as well as a public admirer of the Third Reich. After an interview in Rome with former Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller, Hudal had begun the work of supplying Vatican documentation for such prominent fugitives as Müller, Eichmann, and perhaps Martin Bormann. It was Hudal who gave Father Draganovich the necessary introductions to the International Red Cross and other officials who, for a bribe, could smooth the fugitives' path. Between them, Hudal and Draganovich helped hundreds of Nazis to escape, and perhaps thousands of Croatian Ustasi. Chief of these was the former Croatian dictator Ante Pavelić. According to William Stevenson, however,
Pavelić had since withdrawn into an armed camp in Paraguay, shared with German settlers in the restricted military zone northeast of Asunción. There he worked with Dr. Joseph Mengele, the death camp experimenter and Walter Rauff, who designed and built mass gassing chambers for Auschwitz.
The most prominent Nazis known to have escaped by this route established networks in Latin America, often in alliance with Croatian cohorts, somewhat as follows: Bolivia, Klaus Barbie, with Croatians; Peru, Friedrich Schwend, with Croatians; Chile, Walter Rauff, with Croatians; Ecuador, Alphonse Sassen; Argentina, Otto Skorzeny, Hans Ulrich Rudel, and more recently, Heinrich Müller. This network, the so-called Kameradenwerk, has maintained close political, social, and business ties. By most accounts, Josef Mengele was its leading representative in Paraguay. Two North American authors with wartime intelligence experience, William Stevenson and Ladislas Farago, have pointed to the role of the extensive post-war assets collected or plundered by the SS and Martin Bormann. This came from three sources: the proceeds from the SS forgery of British pound notes, Operation Bernhard, the looting of Jews and other Nazi victims, and, most significantly, the corporate contributions to a special fund set up to guarantee the survival of German multinationals abroad after the impending collapse of Hitler. Soon after the war, OSS found the extensive documentation of a meeting in Strasbourg on August 10, 1944, the purpose of which was to establish this fund, between representatives of the party and of firms like Krupp, Volkswagen, and Messerschmitt. But as the Cold War encouraged the United States to see the German corporate presence in Latin America in a more friendly light, the role of these firms in providing new careers for war criminals abroad was ignored. In fact, it was the key to the post-war status of the Kameraden. Otto Skorzeny, acquitted of his criminal charges by the intervention of Western intelligence, became a sales representative of Krupp. Hans Ulrich Rudel, never charged but an unrepentant Nazi ideologue in the post-war era, became a sales representative of Siemens. Walter Rauff, designer of the gas ovens at Auschwitz, found his first employment in Latin America with a subsidiary of IG Farben, an employer of slave labor at Auschwitz. Franz Paul Stangl, chief of the Treblinka extermination camp, found post-war employment in Latin America with Volkswagen, as did Eichmann with Mercedes-Benz, and so on. But American intelligence may have played a more direct role in the exfiltration of Nazis with the proceeds of Operation Bernhard, the SS forgery of British pound notes. Here again, Western intelligence knew enough about Operation Bernhard to protect the post-war pound by a timely issue of new notes and recall of the old. But by this time, much of the SS profits, an estimated $300 million worth, had been converted to genuine currency. Most of this money has never been traced. The man in charge of laundering the forged banknotes was Friedrich Schwend, who in 1945-46 in North Italy became an important link in setting up the SS escape route to the Vatican. Farago narrates in detail how Heinrich Müller was driven in Schwend's chauffeured Mercedes from Merano, North Italy, to Rome, where he was deposited at a Croatian seminary and made his historic contact with Bishop Hudal. From documents found in Schwend's possession in 1972, he reports that the bulk of the money the Bishop Hudal needed was placed at his disposal by a financier named Friedrich Freddy Merzer, partner of Friedrich Schwend in Operation Bernhard. The money came from the hoard Schwend had amassed in Swiss accounts by the exchange of counterfeit pounds for hard currency. What you will not learn from Farago's and Stevenson's accounts is that in 1945-46, when Schwend was playing this crucial role in setting up the Ratline, Schwend was working for American intelligence.
U.S. documents reveal that after passing into the hands of the 44th CIC detachment, he was used as an informant by American intelligence agencies in Austria, the Austrian Tyrol, and Meran, North Italy.
These long-suppressed details about the post-war American sponsorship of the wanted war criminals, Barbie and Schwend, confirm the recent accusations of John Loftus that the SS Kameraden were exfiltrated as a result of Operation Sunrise, the secret agreement shortly before VE Day between Alan Dulles of OSS Bern and SS General Karl Wolff. As recorded in Dulles's and other official accounts, Operation Sunrise concerned the surrender of German troops in Italy to prevent the needless destruction of civilian property and help forestall a takeover of North Italy by the communist partisans in the area. More recently, revisionist historians have focused on the degree to which Dulles and Wolff, the principal negotiators, exceeded their authorization to negotiate, and in so doing created a major political rift between Stalin and Churchill. Inasmuch as the armistice in North Italy only preceded that in the rest of Europe by 1 week, Operation Sunrise may have had less impact on the outcome of the war than on the survival of the cadres of the SS. One of the principal SS participants in the negotiation was Milan SS Chief Walter Rauff, soon to be a fugitive organizer of the Kameradenwerk. On April 27, 1945, after being visited by Dulles's OSS agent Emilio Daddario in Milan, Rauff surrendered to Army CIC. According to recently declassified American intelligence documents seen by Loftus,
he told Army CIC that he had made arrangements for his surrender in order to avoid further bloodshed in Milan. The arrangements could be confirmed by Hussmann,
i.e. Max Hussmann, a Swiss participant in Sunrise,
and Mr. Dulles, Allied agents in Switzerland.
Later, Rauff told his interrogators how
he himself had been the go-between in negotiating the secret surrender of the SS armies in Italy. He described how he went to Lugano in March 1945 to arrange the release of Allied prisoners in Rauff's custody as a sign of good faith. In return for the surrender of all SS forces, Dulles promised that none of the negotiators would ever be prosecuted as war criminals.
Loftus then confirms the claim of Beata Klarsfeld that Rauff began to work for Dulles and to exfiltrate Nazis through Catholic monasteries while on the OSS payroll.
Despite the Army interrogators' pleas that Rauff is considered a menace if ever set free, and failing actual elimination, is recommended for lifelong internment, Dulles kept his bargain and Rauff was released. According to usually reliable intelligence sources, Dulles then employed Rauff on anti-communist operations in Italy, which was Rauff's specialty under the Nazis. Dulles asked the Vatican to continue his wartime arrangement of using Catholic monasteries and convents to hide OSS agents. After the war, Dulles explained, these safe houses were still needed to smuggle out anti-communist refugees. The Vatican's involvement with Dulles's program was minimal. The Church provided food, shelter, and identity cards, as it did to all refugees. It was Dulles's contacts, not the Vatican, who handled the smuggling of Nazis. According to top-secret State Department documents, the Italian police provided the false passports for Allied agents. The visas came from the Argentine consulate in the Allied intelligence unit based at Trieste, and the embarkation paperwork was handled by a U.S. State Department officer in Genoa. Genoa, incidentally, was Rauff's area of jurisdiction. All of them worked for Dulles, who set up the unwitting Vatican to be the scapegoat if it were ever discovered that Dulles's anti-communist refugees were really SS intelligence agents. To be sure, there were a few priests and even one bishop who smuggled a few of their own Nazi countrymen through Italy. This must allude to the Croats. But that was at extremely low levels of the Vatican and was quietly squelched after the exposure in the Italian press in 1948. The higher-level connection between the Vatican and Dulles is still classified by the government.
Loftus's remarkable charges against Dulles are corroborated by scraps of the public record. In his semi-authorized History of OSS, R. Harris Smith notes that the leading Italian go-between in the negotiations, the industrialist baron and papal chamberlain Luigi Perilli, was in 1948.
Reportedly involved in a CIA operation to prevent a leftist victory in the Italian general elections. It was also rumored that he had concocted a plan to transport ex-Nazis from Germany to Paraguay.
As a Knight of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, SMOM, which issued its own diplomatic passports, Perilli was a member of an international Catholic network well equipped to handle exfiltration. The leading Bavarian Knight of Malta, Baron Erwin von Aretin, was said to have arranged travel for no small number of ex-Nazis after the war. Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, the OSS contact at the Vatican, became the patron of Bishop Hudal's exfiltration efforts.
Montini had under his supervision the Vatican Bureau that issued the refugee travel documents and the Caritas Internationalis, the Church's international welfare organization, which was, at this time and for some years after the war, one of the main charitable institutions aiding the fugitive Nazis.
Like Perilli, Montini was later deeply involved in the CIA's first major post-war covert operation, the efforts to block a communist victory in the 1948 Italian election. This essay, because of its limited scope, cannot go into detail about the intricate contacts established throughout the war between Nazis and the papacy and the United States and Germany. Suffice to say that the common denominator in such informal contacts increasingly became the post-war future of Europe and possible joint steps to exclude the Soviet Union from it. This was especially true after Churchill and Roosevelt had proclaimed the policy of unconditional surrender at Casablanca, a policy which not only dismayed Allen Dulles, but threatened the propriety of his continued contacts with members of the German opposition. Yet even after the failure of the July 1944 plot against Hitler, OSS continued its increasingly questionable contacts, now chiefly with representatives of SS leaders Himmler and Schellenberg. One motive for these contacts was clearly to limit the post-war influence in Western Europe of Soviet power, communist resistance forces, and the civilian communist parties. Another, however, appears to have been to prevent the post-war breakup of German and American intelligence assets, most particularly the Gehlen networks in Eastern and Central Europe, which by 1945 were under the control of Skorzeny and the SS, and OSS itself, which by 1945 was facing increasingly public attack inspired by United States military intelligence and the FBI. It is interesting that Gehlen knew of Karl Wolff's contacts with Dulles as early as January 1945, the month in which they were initiated. From this same period, he began to consolidate his networks for survival after Hitler's downfall, which is to say, he already expected to reach a modus vivendi with the Americans. In April 1945, 1 month before the war ended, Dulles asked Frank Wisner to begin talks with Gehlen, who was not taken into American custody until May 20th. On the Gehlen side, a plan to gain contact with the Americans was approved on April 4th and continued without interruption even after Hitler dismissed Gehlen on April 9th. Curiously, the Operation Sunrise contacts between Wolff and Dulles became most intense in the second half of April 1945, even though at that time both Wolff and Dulles knew they had no authority to negotiate a surrender. On April 17th, Wolff visited Berlin, where Gehlen and his HQ were still located, to be told by Hitler personally that he should temporize in his talks with Dulles because it was still too early to consider a surrender or even serious negotiation. On the same day, Dulles returned to his Bern HQ from the OSS European Theatre HQ in Paris to receive, on April 21st, an April 17th order from the combined Chiefs of Staff to liquidate Operation Sunrise by cutting all contact with Karl Wolff. Undaunted by such restrictions, both men continued to negotiate. Accompanied for the first time by an army representative, Colonel von Schweinitz, Wolff came to Switzerland counting on his personal reputation with the Anglo-Americans to extract guarantees from Dulles that the idealistic and decent men of the army, party, and SS would be able to play an active part in the reconstruction. Dulles, on his part, misrepresented von Schweinitz's explicitly limited instructions as a full power to negotiate. Later, after Wolff had returned to Italy and found himself facing capture by Allied partisans, Dulles allowed an OSS team to participate, together with 2 SS men, in the successful rescue and extrication of Wolfe to Switzerland. The historian Bradley Smith calls this frenzied pursuit of sunrise by Dulles a mere reflex action, the result of failure to realize that Allied victory was imminent in any case. In fact, Dulles and Donovan had to mislead their superiors if their plans for the post-war use of the SS were to succeed. As R. Harris Smith, a former CIA officer, reports deadpan,
only Wolfe's sudden and unexpected offer to sign an unconditional surrender on April 22nd convinced the State Department to reverse its earlier order and to allow Sunrise to proceed.
But no such offer had been made by Wolfe. It was merely an illusion from Dulles's unjustified commentaries, which ran roughshod over the minimal rules of caution and good sense. The OSS policy of rescuing key fascist leaders appears, moreover, to have been systematic. The next day, on April 28th, Dulles's aide Daddario risked his life in Milan to save the fascist marshal Rodolfo Graziani from vengeful socialist partisans. On April 29th in Rome, OSS officer James Angleton would similarly rescue Prince Valerio Borghese by disguising him as a United States Army officer. After the war, Graziani and Borghese became leaders of the neo-fascist MSI party, while their wartime cadres were apparently helped to new anti-communist careers with the support of the Vatican and ultimately the United States. In the months after the war, Angleton helped other fascists and Nazis to escape from prison camps, supplying them when necessary with new identities. There seems no question that by April 1945, OSS was recruiting Nazis and fascists to help mobilize against post-war communism. As a recent historian has observed,
the history of OSS, which is indistinguishable from the secret political history of the war, is marked by a preoccupation with communism almost as intense as its commitment to victory against Germany.
At least some of the SS men who in the last weeks of the war negotiated with OSS were treated thereafter as allies. Wilhelm Hertel, for example, who had transmitted an offer from SS Deputy Head Kaltenbrunner, worked after the war like his former subordinate Schwend as an informant for the CIC in Austria. Walter Rauff, who had negotiated in Milan with Dulles's aide Daddario, was also spared despite having directed the mobile gas chambers in Nazi-occupied Russia. By his own account, which has been reported as fact in the American press, Rauff escaped after his arrest by United States troops to move with Vatican help first to Vatican City and then Syria. British and French sources agree, however, that Rauff, by as early as June 1945, had established himself in Genoa. There, with the aid of Cardinal Siri, Bishop of Genoa, Rauff organized a transit camp where as many as 5,000 fleeing Nazis were sheltered before their departure to Argentina, Syria, or Egypt. The French Nazi hunter Beata Klarsfeld claims that, like his Kameradenwerk ally Schwend, Rauff too was working with American intelligence before escaping to Chile. This seems probable, inasmuch as Schwend was working for the Austrian CIC while setting up the Murano station of what became known as the Ratline. At some point, moreover, certainly by the early 1950s, the CIA and the Geilan Org were working together to move Geilan agents, headed by Skorzeny, to Egypt. Long before these officially authorized movements, Donovan and Dulles must have seen that, with a global network of its V-men already in place, the Geilan Org would be an even more impressive asset, in their case, for a post-war CIA. The arrangements by Donovan and Dulles for an OSS-SS deal do not appear to have been approved at the time at any higher level. Indeed, as late as December 1945, the War Department refused United States intelligence officers permission to collaborate with even the Geilan organization, whose pre-war origins lay not in the Nazi SS, but the eventually decapitated Abwehr, or German military intelligence. More importantly, Roosevelt had already tabled, as too controversial, the memo from OSS Chief William J. Donovan, which Allen Dulles had drafted, for converting the wartime OSS into a permanent CIA. In dealing with the SS, Dulles and Donovan knew that this risky operation could easily backfire against OSS, whose organizational future had already been challenged by J. Edgar Hoover and traditionalists in American military intelligence. But they also knew that just as the OSS was the best hope for the survival of the SS cadres, so, in a sense, these SS cadres were their highest trump card in the impending contest for OSS's own institutional survival. What ultimately persuaded Truman in 1947 to 48 to authorize an operational CIA was in fact partly the need to find an institutional home for the post-war Gehlen org. Sources: Bauer, Tom. Klaus Barbie, Butcher of Leon. Granada, 1984. Farago, Ladislas. Aftermath. Avon, 1975. Linklater, Magus, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Asherson. The Nazi Legacy, Klaus Barbie, and the International Fascist Connection. Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, 1984. Loftus, John. The Belarus Secret. Knopf, 1982. Loftus, John. A Nazi war criminal with a high U.S. connection. Boston Globe, May 28, 1984. Powers Thomas, The Man Who Kept the Secrets, Richard Helms, and the CIA. Knopf, 1979. Ryan, Alan A., Klaus Barbie and the United States Government, A Report to the Attorney General of the United States, U.S. Department of Justice, Criminal Division, 1983. Sayer, Ian, and Douglas Botting, Nazi Gold, The Story of the World's Greatest Robbery and Its Aftermath. Granada, 1984. Smith, Bradley F., and Elena Agarossi. Operation Sunrise, The Secret Surrender. Basic Books, 1979. Smith, R. Harris. OSS, The Secret History of America's First Central Intelligence Agency. University of California Press, 1972. Stevenson, William. The Borman Brotherhood. Bantam, 1974. You have been listening to a production of Communist Education, produced for purely educational and archival purposes. All rights reserved.